This video is another video from the lesson about political changes in France and Britain from the late 19th century to World War I. And so the title of the lesson is about the making of parliamentary regimes in these two countries. So in part one we saw the building of the Third Republic in France, and so this is the beginning of part two about Britain. Contrary to France, Britain knew no revolution during the 19th century and ever since. And it does not mean that political change did not happen in the late 19th century. In fact, it did happen, but it happened the British way. And this is the reason why I have entitled the second part, Strengthening and Democratizing the Parliamentary Monarchy in Britain. As previously seen in other lessons, the question of franchise was very important in Britain because, contrary to France, there was no proclamation of universal suffrage during the 19th century. In this lesson, we must speak about the last law about franchise, the last enlargement, which took place before World War I, and this happened in 1884. But first of all, a quick reminder of the previous steps in this process of enlargement. It was actually a very progressive process of reform, and we can analyze it as the granting of this right to vote by the ruling elite of Britain to only the higher level of the educated and social influential elite of the working class. In 1832, the Great Reform Act enlarged slightly franchise to 8% of adults and only men. Okay, so 4% of adults. Actually, only the richest, so only the bourgeoisie and the very high elite of working class, a very skilled worker, could vote at that moment. Then in 1867, after and despite the Chartist movement, the Second Reform Act doubled the number of voters, but in the end it was only 16% of all adults that could vote. So the last step was in 1884-1885, in fact the law was passed at the very end of the year, the Representation of the People Act, or Third Reform Act. This act was imposed by the Prime Minister of the Liberal government of Britain, William Gladstone. The Liberals had long been the main supporters of the enlargement of franchise, and their decision was to give vote to all men, but only men, paying an annual rental of £10, which means that you could be a voter and not a property owner. So this meant 30% of adults. And despite the limitation of this reform, it was met by the total opposition of the Tories, of the Conservatives, which were led by the very aristocratic Lord Derby at that moment. And Lord Derby famously characterized the reform as a leap in the dark, which shows how the aristocratic elite, supported by the Conservative Party at that moment, was totally appalled by that kind of democratization, and they really believed that the British society and political system could fall apart if more electors, if the number of active citizens was changed in this country. So they were really men of the past on that issue in particular. But if we compare the situation to France at the same moment, we can only observe that there's a real contrast. In Britain, contrary to France, universal suffrage was absolutely not conceived as an automatic right of all male citizens. It must be said that pressure for universal male vote was not absent, but totally ineffective, because in fact the people who were still denied the vote, so the really poorest, they did not form a coherent social group capable of effective political organization for demanding the vote. No, they were people that were struggling so much with everyday life that their struggle was economic survival, not political rights. On the contrary, there was one social group who managed to organize itself in an influential pressure group. That was the educated, single women of the British middle class. Which leads us to this very important moment of Britain's political life, the question of women's suffrage. So, during the Victorian era, so the second half of the 19th century, the social influence of women remained largely submitted to men. In particular, as soon as women got married, they lost most of their rights. Single women had a bit more civil and political rights, and it's for them in particular that progressive change happened by reform. In the 1870s, more rights were given to women regarding property, the custody of children, and even the right to vote and stand for elections, but only at the local level. The leader and the icon of the movement in favor of women's suffrage at the end of the 19th century was Millicent Fawcett. She was the wife of an active politician, and at the beginning of the 1890s, she pulled together some existing societies in favor of women's suffrage and creating a national union of women's suffrage society. This is what we call the suffragist movement. It tried to promote the ideas of women's vote, but mostly by peaceful and legal means, such as lobbying of politicians and organizing rallies with public speeches. Okay, but this remained rather peaceful, and in fact not very effective when it came to a reform for the national level, for the general election. It was still totally denied. That's the reason why, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually in 1903, there was a split in the suffragist movement. And the most radical members decided to form a new organization called the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, which, as you can see on this famous photograph, was a middle-class woman, but she promoted very radical action. These political activists are those who are known as the suffragettes. Actually, the term suffragettes was coined by a journalist from the Daily Mail. So the Daily Mail was the first and most famous tabloid newspaper of Britain. It means newspapers created at the end of the 19th century for the working class, which were highly illustrated, which often used very easy stories to get the working class people interested in the news and buying newspapers. But the Daily Mail was rather conservative, and so they used the term suffragettes as an insult. Suffragettes used the political means of the suffragists, like political meetings and rallies, and they had very efficient slogans, like the famous "Deeds, not words." They created a color scheme of purple, white, and green, which remained which is strongly associated to their struggle. But their specific strategy was the use of radical action. Good example is what Annie Kenney and Christabel Pankhurst did in 1905. They decided to go to a meeting of the politician David Lloyd George in Manchester and to create such an unrest by shouting during the meeting that they could be arrested. This is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to be sent to prison. Because when they were released from prison a couple of days later, they had become political superstars. And they went back to the free trade hall where they had committed their crime, and they did their own meeting, and it was extremely successful. So the use of violence was totally assumed by the suffragettes and their leader Emmeline Pankhurst in particular. As soon as they could be arrested, they tried and often managed to be arrested. Here you can see a very famous picture of Emmeline Pankhurst arrested in front of Buckingham Palace because she was trying to present a petition to the king. The reason why the violent methods were used by the suffragettes in the 1910s was that they knew that women's vote now existed in other countries of the British Commonwealth, like Australia and South Africa. Used violence like smashing windows, but also putting acid in letter boxes, and even using bombs. They were arrested, and in prison they also wanted their stay in prison to be a political act. So they demanded to get the status of political prisoner, which was denied to them by the British government, who wanted to treat them like ordinary criminals. That's the reason why they started to do hunger strikes, which is actually a kind of action that political prisoners often do and often did in history. The reaction of the government to the hunger strikes was to force feed the women. That was a very brutal struggle, as you can see. In 1913, a law was passed by the Liberal government to allow to put an end to force feeding, to allow the suffragettes to be released before they got sick. That was a way to prevent them from going on hunger strike. If they started a hunger strike, they were released. But they did not want to be released. So they nicknamed this law the Cat and Mouse Acts, because it was like a game of cat and mouse between the suffragettes and the government. Okay, that's a very famous event and an illustration of the suffragette struggle. Talking about violence, the use of violence by the suffragettes, there is one activist who went down in history as a kind of martyr of the suffragettes' cause. Her name was Emily Davison. She had already put a bomb at David Lloyd George's house, country house. David Lloyd George was a very important member of the government. And in 1913, she decided to go to the most important sport event of the moment, called the Epsom Derby. It was a sport and a social event where all the aristocracy was present. It's a horse race. And she knew that the horse of the king would be racing on that day. And what she did was that she wanted to stop the king's horse as a political act. She did so, the horse fell, and she died. So, well, it must be said that in the public opinion of Britain, people got often more anxious for the horse than for Emily Davison. But inside the suffragette movement, she became really a martyr, and her funerals became a mass event, a mass political action, which is what she wanted. Okay, and so she became a kind of hero and martyr of the suffragettes' cause. Another less tragic but very striking event is that in 1914, another activist slashed a famous painting by Velázquez at the National Gallery of Venus as a symbol of the struggle of women. In fact, what put an end to the suffragette movement was World War I, because they clearly decided to stop their struggle when World War I broke out. And so these questions would be solved after the war.